I'm Simon Chatterton. I'm Strategic Lead for 101 Outdoor Arts. I'm a white male in my 50s with dark, slightly greying hair. Thanks for being here. I'm delighted that you've made it to the second week of ODC 21 and that you're here for what promises to be a fascinating symposium focused on dance and the outdoors.
Hi everyone, my name's Christina Elliott and I'm senior producer at The Place. I'd like to echo Simon's welcome. It's really lovely to feel your presence here with us this morning. I'm a white woman in my late 30s, blue eyes, brown hair in a sort of short bob, and today I'm wearing a white shirt and I use the pronouns she and her. So I'm going to go through some housekeeping before we begin today. We're really pleased to welcome you to FeedLoop, which is our virtual conferencing environment for the next 2 days. Throughout the symposium, you'll be visiting different event rooms in FeedLoop, and we also invite you to explore FeedLoop's fantastic networking potential. If you click on the speakers and networking tabs on the left-hand side, you can reach out to colleagues and friends, meet somebody new, and make new connections. You can post any questions that you have in the FeedLoop chat, and we'll endeavour to answer these throughout the sessions or at the end. You can access closed captions by clicking on the CC button in the bottom right-hand corner of the frame. And we're also really pleased to be working with artist Temujin Gunawardena, who will be scribing during the event, and we'll be seeing videos of those at the end of the sessions. The sessions are being recorded and will be available on the Place and 101's websites after the event, along with the transcripts.
Christina and I would like to introduce the partners that are bringing you this symposium. Firstly, a little about 101. 101's a national centre for the development of work outdoors and in public space. We're based in a 20,000 square foot warehouse on the former Greenham Common airbase near Newbury. And we host over 40 artistic residencies a year, with literally hundreds of artists staying with us on a residential basis to make outdoor work. We also present a range of labs, symposia, and artist development programs around performance in public space, of which this event forms part.
The Place is a centre for dance development in London. In our base in Camden, we have opportunities for people to watch, create and participate in dance. And we also have a growing producing and touring programme which reaches far beyond our London base, and this includes outdoor dance. We're part of a fantastic little consortium of organisations commissioning outdoor dance with Festival.org, Tramway and DanceXchange called Stomping Ground. And this year, we're really proud to be producing Reckart and Rosenberg's new show, Future Cargo, which for anyone who was around last week was part of the pitching events. I'd also like to introduce our partners on the Outdoor Dance Collection. So the Outdoor Dance Collection is part of Birmingham International Dance Festival's professional and industry strand. It's a new Outdoor Dance Collection is a new dance and outdoor arts industry programme of events for professional delegates and artists. And it includes the UK Dance Showcase and the Dance and the Outdoors Symposium. Birmingham International Dance Festival is produced by DanceXchange, which is a dance development organisation in the West Midlands. It's a biennial festival presenting a vibrant programme of international dance in venues and public spaces across Birmingham, creating distinctive new work, building audiences and engaging communities in stimulating participatory activity. In 2021, the festival has 2 editions, a digital one in June and a live one in September. I'd really like to thank Lucy and her team, and also Maggie and the team at XTRAX for their support in delivering this event. And I'd also like to thank Arts Council England for their support.
I wanted to create this symposium for a couple of years now, because it feels like it's a particularly exciting time for outdoor dance. So many different artists and organisations are engaging with the idea of making dance in very different contexts outside traditional venue spaces. I'm hoping that in this event, we go beyond conversations about just presenting outdoor dance, but instead take a deeper dive to hear more from a range of fascinating artists about the hows and whys of the making of work itself. What is it that drives dancers and choreographers to create performance for public space? And what is it that shapes the ways that they work and how audiences and participants engage with dance and the outdoors?
So you're here on day one of the symposium, and we've got a really fantastic lineup ahead of us. And in a moment, we're going to introduce Rosemary Lee, who's going to be doing our keynote presentation. And then shortly after that finishes, at 11:10, there's a session on politics and poetics of dancing outdoors with Anne Le Battard, Bota Seva, Charlotte Spencer, Sho Shibata, and that's chaired by Sanjoy Roy. And then after lunch at 1:10, we have a session on community, co-curation and collaboration with Jennifer Jean Charles, Luca Silvestrini, Marva Antoine, Suba Subramanianam, and chaired by Rosemary Lee.
In day two, we're starting at 10 a.m. with a fun physical warm-up by Elaine Dance. 10 minutes designed to get your blood flowing ahead of the day's stimulating content. Following on from this, we'll be hosting two fascinating panels. Our first session runs from 10 o'clock to 11:20 and is focused on architecture and scenography, looking at some of the fundamental aspects of how we choose to work with dance in the built or natural environment. Then, following this, we offer a glimpse of how artists might be exploring the future of dance on a panel on digital play and exploration that runs from 11:30 to 12:40.
So you, the audience, have a really important role to play today. You can use the Feedloop platform to post comments and questions during the session. And the speakers and chairs are really looking forward to those questions and interacting with you during the sessions. You can also join the conversation on social media using the hashtag Outdoor Dance Symposium, or tag us using handles The Place London and 101 Outdoor Arts. And we'll be live tweeting and sharing your comments throughout the day, so please share any thoughts or inspiration on Twitter.
Finally, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our keynote speaker for the event, Rosemary Lee, a choreographer whose track record in creating rich, moving, and thought-provoking sighted work is virtually unparalleled in this country. Rosie has been choreographing, performing, and directing for over 30 years. Her unique way of working creates a portrait of both the individuals and the close performing communities that she brings together, whilst also exploring and highlighting our relationship with our environment. Over to you, Rosie.
Thank you so much, Simon, and thank you for that introduction and for the invitation to give this keynote speech. I'm a white 60-something-year-old woman with fair, short hair, glasses, and a dark blue shirt on. My pronouns are she and her, and I just want to start this keynote speech to acknowledge my privilege as a white woman. This is a really exciting and nerve-wracking challenge for me to reflect on this area of work more deeply and more widely. I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, reading a written text to keep me to time. I will illustrate the talk with slides of my own work and of others, and give you a break from my face. I'm acutely aware and humbled that in this virtual gathering of many peers and experts, and I thank you for listening to me. I'm approaching this presentation as a maker, and therefore this is a really personal viewpoint from my own experience. The invitation has prompted me to reflect on the wider field in which my own work sits, and consider whose shoulders I or we might be standing on, who and what has come before us. I felt it might be worth a few minutes to reflect on the history of dancing outside, very generally, because I'm not a dance scholar, before going into detail and interrogating my own practice to open up some considerations that might come up over the 2 days. So here goes. I think of dance in its broadest definition as human behavior. Our feeling of aliveness is grounded in our own movement. Our body is our world. It's how we make sense of the world outside ourselves, how we know it, how we love it, and how we fight it. Dancing is fundamental to humanity. Now, I know you all know that, but I think it's worth noting that in some parts of the world, dancing is banned, and that therefore shows how powerful, potent, and life-changing dancing is. Just as it's part of civilization, there is a fundamental fear that dancing might and can uncivilize us. It might mobilize us both as individuals or en masse in the wrong way. I'm just going to ask Liam, our wonderful technical support, if we could go to the slideshow now, please. Thanks, Liam. And I'm presuming you can see a slide on screen. Let's hope so, because I can't tell what you can see. But here are just a few pictures gleaned from the Commons Wikimedia.org of dancing outdoors across cultures and across ages. In all of these, people are dancing outside as part of a gathering. These dances might help to share in or stimulate a collective feeling or attitude, a belonging perhaps. They might help us to celebrate, to mourn, to arouse, to exercise a right, to honor, to make sense of the world, to mark time, to empower, to help us to partake in or witness an act of enlivening. I suggest that these take place outdoors for both practical and other reasons. The obvious practical reason that outdoors you have more room for the dancers, the audience, and if participatory, for the people to join in. There's space. But the other reasons might include that the indoor space might have stronger connotations, history, and meaning. It might not be as inclusive. It might not be able to speak to or of the community. It might not be yours. You might not be welcome there. It might cost too much. It might literally be out of bounds. Then also for many, and I include myself here, the connection between the human being dancing their existence and aliveness is inseparable from the land they exist on, the environment they dwell in, the seasons and weather they depend on. The circadian rhythms of sunrise and sunset is all the more evident outside in natural light. And of course, if there are gods or God to gesture to, they might be able to see us more clearly. This metaphor out of bounds that I just wrote earlier tripped off the keypad before I'd thought about its significance. It reminds me of the ancient ritual of beating the bounds. That's remarking the borders of a community regularly, as animals do, only they often wee and poo, and we might dance instead. Look at this one. So those two photos are examples of dance in relation to marking borders. I'm sorry, I'm just going to go back to that one and stay there for a second. The outdoor feels and seems, and indeed was, and still sometimes is, public, but it's complex. We'll come back to what public space might mean later. Public, Google tells me this is the definition of that adjective: of or concerning the people as a whole, done, perceived, or existing in open view. Personally, I want to, and I hope, I make work concerning people as a whole that exists in open view. Naive, idealistic, simplistic, perhaps, I don't care, but it's the reason I work outside, to be more public. Many things have influenced and inspired me, and I'd like to share a very few that thread in with this very broad introduction. Here they are more specifically relating to my cultural history in the UK, so forgive me, international colleagues. I was born in 1959. And in the 70s, my interest and respect for traditional forms in music and dance began, fed by the folk revival in the UK in that decade. I attended the Barsham Fairs that gave rise to the now infamous Albion Fairs of the 70s. A cross between medievalness and hippiedom. This fair was made from scratch by volunteers in a field, in a village in rural East Anglia. People came from all around, from all walks of life, travellers, theatre makers, Women's Institute, fortune tellers, local dance schools. Everyone seemed welcome. It was all handmade and non-corporate, non-policed, and for the people. I lived for this annual fair. Its wild inclusiveness and bravery to be untroubled by the mix of people, its accepting communal spirit left its indelible mark. In the 70s in Britain, there was also a burgeoning of experimental participatory outdoor theatre, not least the extraordinary company Welfare State International. Here's an extract from their 1972 manifesto. They say, an entertainment, an alternative, a way of life. We make images, invent rituals, devise ceremonies, objectify the unpredictable, and enhance atmospheres for particular places, times, situations, and people. You can see a site called Unfinished Histories to view these companies and their extraordinary work. I witnessed and was involved in some of this kind of large-scale participatory theatre, both here and the US, with and for communities in outdoor sites that were important or familiar to them. I wanted to make work as a choreographer on a similar scale and ambition, but where the participants were not lantern makers and carriers, but where they were highlighted as expressive individuals, where intimacy was paramount within the epicness, where spectacle gave way to the potential of human form and spirit. So here are some images of my earliest outdoor work as a choreographer working alone. My first small commission in 1987, New Springs from Old Winters. This is the procession that danced its way through the streets of Oxford, leading to an indoor work in the town hall for 75 dancers of all ages. One policeman was present. Here is the Abbots Bromley Horn Dance, danced from dawn to sunset in a sleepy Midlands town once a year. They carry prehistoric ancient antlers, and the dancers are from local families. The men of those families come back from all over the world to dance each year. The very heavy antlers were handed to the wives, sisters, and girlfriends when I was there, who danced it in a pub car park in their stilettos and tight skirts. Then the Thai chefs from the takeaway came out in their white chef's outfits and also joined in. I was so moved by seeing this dance finally in 2008. Durational performance and endurance performance, it's been done for centuries. It's still done quietly, largely going unnoticed by the contemporary arts world. The nature of these displays, perhaps you call them, I'm not sure they would call them a display or a performance, is interesting. There's a nonchalance in the performer, a sense that they've put down their beer and just started jumping. There's an ease between the expert folk dancer and the passerby. There is no performance gaze or persona. We recognize in the trained classical or contemporary dancer, though these dancers are in elaborate costumes. This laid-back pedestrian quality I find really compelling and refreshing, and a great mirror to hold up to the contemporary world of dance, and particularly to my own practice as a real challenge. I often ask myself, what conventions have I brought with me outdoors from my indoor contemporary dance training? And would they make no sense in this new context to the general public? How do contemporary dance forms, classical and conservatoire trained forms of codified dance, sit when they're open to view outdoors? What's their relationship with the unsuspecting audience member, with the context? Folk dances accompanied other rites and practices that were not only to do with the rural calendar, but the industrial life too. And some probably originate from protest and defiance against landlords and oppression of state and religion. Carnival, after all, is a license to indulge and let rip before a period of control and fasting, and its history is complex. Folk traditions undoubtedly influenced companies like welfare, state, and festivals such as Glastonbury, Woodstock, and beyond. But let's not forget too that the outdoors is a place of artistic experimentation, where new forms of dance are developing as we speak, forms that rise up from individuals and communities who cannot afford to rent studios and might not feel at home in them either. Breakdancing in the late 70s and 80s that gave rise to hip hop, practiced and performed by dazzling new experts on the streets of Brooklyn and the Bronx on their bits of cardboard. Or the extraordinary crumping, which I couldn't find a picture in copyright of, which was created with and for the communities of the inner city streets of Los Angeles. I see that as such a devotional dance form. Then in the history of Western contemporary dance, Isadora Duncan performed outdoors and danced there for inspiration. She felt freer there from the conventions of other dance forms. Trisha Brown performed on rooftops or rafts on lakes and down the sides of buildings, redefining what dance could be. And here is Rosemary Butcher, UK choreographer, whose early work, inspired by the Judge and Church movement, often took place outdoors. Her cool, abstract aesthetic, exploring the human form in architectural urban environments. These postmodern works were also hugely influential for me and many more. And lastly, I must mention the tradition of circus. Its nomadic lifestyle, admittedly in the big top in our minds, but also often outdoors, and its crossover with dance being so rich currently. I couldn't resist those two photos. This one, a slide of ancient traditional hoot dance of the Native American Indians, a tradition that goes across many tribes. Though it's a show dance for an individual dancer, its origins is in the reflecting and honoring of the cycles of nature and the cosmos we depend on. They really know a thing or two about orbits. Could we stop the shared screen, Liam, and return to my face for a second? Thanks. So how does this broad introduction tie into the work we make and promote today? I'd argue that this area of dance practice outdoors is immensely rich, hugely diverse, powerful, and full of potential. And its history is rooted in pageant, procession, carnival, festival, ritual, and experimental. Taking to the streets and to landscapes, urban and rural, to dance is nothing new. It's rooted in our many cultures. When social dancing, display, performance, folk ethos, and contemporary aesthetics, activism and experimentation collide and overlap, I personally get hugely excited. I'd like now to reveal my own practice, particularly in relation to site and context. But let me start by giving you a sort of nutshell summary of what kind of work I make and why I make work outdoors and what my aims are for it. My work is site specific. It's very rarely site generic. I think that's the term. That means your work is transferable from site to site or community to community. Although I wish I could work like that more often, I'm trying. It often takes a long time to develop, over 2 years, due to the research time I take, the recruitment of the cast, and the engagement of local people. The resulting work can be durational. It's often, but not always, involves non-professionals and professionals. It's often large in scale, but not always. I also make films and installations, and with few exceptions, those are all shot and created outdoors. I really appreciate that my more embedded way of working is one end of a scale, and this symposium addresses work that is at the other end of the scale, arriving and departing a site over a few hours. I celebrate this range and diversity of approach and advocate for as much diversity in programming as possible to allow and encourage artists to work and engage with site and community in these various ways on different scales and with varied sensibilities. There is no one size fits all, and borrowing an ecological metaphor, a healthy cultural environment is when it is at its most diverse. Liam, could we share the screen again, please, and go back to the slides? Hopefully the slideshow is where we left off on the hoop dance. Okay, so I'm going to show you several images to give you a sense of some of the work and the context over the last few years, and they're in reverse order. And I realize I've picked only green spaces. I do work on concrete sometimes, sorry. I want my work to be for the general public and unsuspecting passers-by, as well as for the knowing, choosing, dance, arts, literate audience. And though it's risky, I want the challenge of this. Working in theatres as a young artist usually meant a very limited audience in terms of age, socioeconomic and ethnic background. It just felt too exclusive for me, in London particularly. Working on site means people get to watch rehearsals for free for the whole time that we're in residence there if they want to, and they can come back regularly and form relationships with us. And sometimes, where I'm really fortunate, the performance is free to view. I love when that happens. I see my work as a gift, so to be able to give it in this way feels much easier to me. As a child, I felt the natural world keenly and my relationship to it, be it in the pear tree I climbed, the sea I respectfully was scared of but loved to swim in, or the cow's eyes I stared into. This intense relationship with the detail and the elemental nature of my surroundings have left me feeling that those encounters feel similar to the encounters with art and theatre, similarly intense, similarly transformative at their best. So I want to offer the audience the possibility to sense the environment more keenly or with a new, renewed, polished lens as a result of the work I make. In sensing ourselves in relation to the space and time we inhabit, we can be enlivened, sensing our place in the carbon cycle more viscerally and intellectually, comprehending it through our bodies and our minds. I want to add to a site just for a moment and become a fleeting part of its history and of people's memories of it. In a small way, I hope the work might contribute to deepening people's connections with the natural world and an understanding of their dependency on it at a time of climate emergency. I tend to work from the site first. If I'm commissioned by a venue, region, or festival, I generally then look for the site, then consider who and how many performers I would like to engage with. It varies, but that's the general rule. I consider if my presence there will be generally welcome, though I expect there may be some resistance, and if the nature of my intervention will be intrusive or damaging, and if it will be, I won't work in that site. I'm looking for a site that I can work in a nuanced, delicate partnership with, where the site literally, physically, and metaphorically holds the work, and where the work can hold the site. For example, I doubt I could create work for a shopping mall because the environment would compete with the figures and the public there have their consumer mindsets on. I don't think that mindset is open as easily to the poetic. The work would be destroyed in that context. When I'm at a site, I'm also asking who owns the site? How does that affect the work, the audience, the access? How does it sit with my principles? Can I trust the owner, be it council, developer, or institution? What associations might the site bring to people? What has happened there recently and in the past? Who comes here and who doesn't, and why not? What happens here on the radar and under the radar? Do I want to highlight something about the site? Do I want to put the site on the map, or does the commissioner? Then, of course, I'm asking, where could the dressing room be? The warm-up facilities? Where are the toilets? Where's the cafes? What's the surface? How will it be in different seasons? Where does the sun rise and set? How safe is it? How much dog poo is there? Is there an audience for the work? Reminder to self, never, never underestimate your audience. On every project, I'm blown away by people's engagements and their acute observations. This brings me to what I feel I am or should be or could be responsible for. I want to be respectful of the site and who feels ownership over it. Just at this point, Liam, could we return to my face for just a little while? Thank you. I'll repeat that again, my responsibilities. So I want to be respectful of the site and who feels ownership over it. I don't want to damage the trees or disturb nesting birds. I don't want to get in the way of anyone's reverie, exercise or play, kiss, spliff, drug deal or route to childcare. These spaces house so much, and who am I to strut in and do my stuff without care? Art in their terms may have no importance. All of us, insects, plants, birds, trees, humans, rats alike, lay claim to this territory. It is home to many. But equally, I know that this is public space, and I am within my rights to be there. I know that looking at a place with fresh outsider eyes often helps local people see their habitat anew. It can help them be prouder of it or more steward-like. Raising the profile, for example, of that Tottenham great oak may have enriched people's relationships with it, and it may have safeguarded its future. Who knows? Coming as a maverick artist may be just the thing to shift the status quo of a place, to shake up the invisible boundaries that exist in any space. So my responsibility is to tread a fine line, trying to be sensitive to site and inhabitant, and at the same time, trusting the power of the dance form to do its magic, checking my assumptions, but not losing courage. Then I must be responsible for the experience of the participant, be they professional or non-professional, aiming to enrich their own experience of the art form and deepen their relationship to the site. Lastly, I must be responsible for the work itself, nurturing it and finding a way for it to best survive the ever-changing weather and surprising events that can come to challenge you when you least expect it outdoors. Work is fragile. If the context isn't working, it can fall on its face in a second. Could we come back to the slides one more time? Thank you, Liam. I'd like to finish with a case study, focusing on one of the dances that made up square dancing in 2011, commissioned by Dance Umbrella, a work in 4 public squares, green spaces in Bloomsbury, in the heart of London, with the audience walking between them, 4 dances in each, 12 to 15 minutes long, 2 performed on the hour, the other 2 on the half hour, to allow the audience to move between each dance in any order they wished. Performed 6 times a day over 2 days, free to view. In Gordon Square were 100 women, Brunswick Gardens 35 men, Woburn Square 10 children, and Queen's Square, that we'll come to, 23 students from the London Contemporary Dance School. All the dances involved some kind of bells, hand rung. There was no other equipment. I wanted the spaces untouched and unchanged so that the dance flowed through them and out into the city with no trace, like a flock of birds. Queen's Square, that we're coming to, here we are in the next slide, is a darker, less middle-class square with benches all around the edges, with memorial plaques on each bench honouring a doctor who had worked in the nearby 2 hospitals, Great Ormond Street and the Neurological Hospital. I know this square personally, as one of my children was very ill and attended the Children's Hospital for many years. He's recovered, by the way. I decided on solos for this site, in contrast to the 100 women and 35 men who flock and move together in unison. I counted the benches and then that I could use that had space for a soloist without a rubbish bin in the way. I then worked with 23 dancers or so, each of whom created their own solo out of a palette of 80 tasks that we worked on as a group first. If you sat on a bench for the performance, you got to see 3 different soloists. I knew this square needed great sensitivity, but I didn't fully appreciate that until I started working and rehearsing there, how challenging it was going to be, and here is why. I sat and watched who regularly used the square. There were vulnerable homeless people seeking privacy, doctors and nurses in their scrubs having a quiet cigarette, usually exhausted looking and needing to be invisible. Then there were the relatives, using a bench to make a phone call, to share often bad news, and even patients in their pajamas with their drips. These hospitals treat very, very sick adults and children. I was dealing here with a park that quietly and darkly held grief, pain, and loss. And then there was the local dog walker with 3 very old dogs, including a blind one. She was so incensed by us working there, despite our smiles and attempts to chat and admire her dogs. She made a point of telling us we were wasting our time waving our bloody arms about in her park. She made sure her dogs pooped where she knew we needed to dance and kept them off the lead so they stumbled into dances. I regret we never won her over. She was the local landlady. We never entered her pub either. I needed to find a concept, a way of working with these young dancers to help everyone. Each time we rehearsed, I asked them to go to the person on the bench and quietly tell them what they were about to do, and that if they could ignore them or move to another bench, or if they would prefer, the dancer would stop rehearsing. I've got no pictures of those people, of course. Sorry, here we are. At first, this was very hard for them to do, but soon they began to see it as part of their practice, to engage sensitively with the park user and respect their privacy. If we noticed someone desperately unhappy, we made sure to move everything so they were undisturbed. Many times as a choreographer and facilitator, I felt I might be overstepping the mark here and letting art be more important than it should be in this very particular intense circumstance. I wondered if I could properly protect these young dancers and protect the public, both patients, parents, street folk, doctors and hospital workers. But the way we practiced and the way the students and Lauren Potter, my assistant, sensitively rose to the challenge, most of the students maturing so quickly, I realized it was okay to be doing it. I had proof in the positive responses from the people on the benches and also in the ignoring, which I needed to see people could do too if they needed to. One man, a patient, sat in his wheelchair with his wife and verbally abused one beautiful young male dancer as he rehearsed, calling him a fairy, etc. The dancer didn't tell me for a while, regrettably, and I couldn't hear these quiet conversations across the whole park. Once we spotted him returning, Lauren went and chatted to him and sat with him to put him at his ease. He arrived the next rehearsal with his mistress, it seemed, then with his children, then with his wife again, each time watching more, introducing his family, and seemingly prouder and prouder of this regular encounter with the young lad, until he apologized to the dancer, saying, "I gave you a hard time, didn't I, mate?" That was one extraordinary moment. The solos were devised in response to the site and its complexity. Each task I gave them was relevant to the suffering I felt around me. Though rich and intricate, these solos have periods of stillness, listening and sensing, and many parts where the eyes were closed, so that the person on the bench in rehearsal and the subsequent audience members could watch them without feeling awkward and could see the dancer's own sensitivity and vulnerability. They're listening. moments where they could sense the wind as the dancer did, see the leaves moving across the grass, and settle their breathing in their hearts. Towards the end of the rehearsal period, I had found the last part of the structure to make this work better. At the start of each solo, the dancer approached the people on the bench with a biro in hand and told them they were going to dance a 3-minute solo for them. Would anyone like to dedicate the dance to someone? If someone suggested a name, the dancer wrote the name on the inside of their arm, and by the end of the performance days, their arms were covered. This concept meant that the people could dedicate the dance to their loved one in the hospital, for example, or even to themselves, as one very ill person did, humbly asking permission if he could do so. One other dedicated it to all the suffering in the world, poor young dancer bearing that on their shoulders for 3 minutes. Mostly someone would be openly weeping by the end of the solo, and often asked how the dancer knew that's what the person they had dedicated the dance to was like. They often felt the dance encapsulated them. Liam, that's the end of the slideshow. Could you just come back to my face for the very ending remarks? Thank you. The power of the viewer's imagination and love, the power of the dance and the dancer, and the power of this encounter in a public space. I hope this gives you a sense of how a site can determine and shape a work, and how an intervention can change a site, and how enriching that partnership can be for artist, promoter, performer, and audience alike. I hope you can see that it's really difficult to separate site from community, that everywhere is rich with history. And yes, sites belong to institutions, developers, and governments legally and commercially, perhaps, but they belong to others in much deeper, more nuanced ways, to humans and non-humans. Public spaces should be for gatherings, for encounters, and for diverse communities. Too often they've been bought up, boundaried, privatized, monetized, and corporatized. This incenses me. I believe in the commons. I urge you to tread and dance both carefully and delicately, boldly and urgently in the great outdoors. We need it more than ever in the midst of this corporate age and climate emergency. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Rosie. That was wonderful and really inspiring. Thank you for those extraordinary insights and images. And that was a very moving example at the end that you shared with us. So we are getting some questions into the chat, but please do, if you have any questions for Rosemary, post them in the Feedloop chat and I will ask them. We've got about 15 minutes for this. But before I dive into those questions, I just have one for you, Rosie. I really enjoyed how you were talking about the sort of dance as how it might uncivilize us, and the moment it was Barsham Fair talking about it being unpoliced, and I picked up a kind of yearning perhaps in your presentation for those moments of informality, and I wondered if you think back on your work, what's the moment when, or the work where you've maybe come closest to that, sort of, you know, that example you gave of the people who would put down their beer and then start jumping. Yeah. Where have you come close?
Oh gosh, that's such a great question. And do you know what? I'm thinking about talking about this keynote speech to Wendy Houston, who actually I don't think does work outdoors. Brilliant practitioner, UK practitioner who works indoors. And she was saying to me how she remembers a man that used to walk down the curb in Kentish Town, dancing on the tips of his toes, and everyone knew him. And he just danced spontaneously. And it's characters like that that I can think of from my past that I love, this sort of informality and permission. Maybe you're talking about permission to dance outdoors and to be that dancing figure outdoors. in terms of that unpolicingness, and I guess, unfortunately, we're also perhaps saying lack of health and safety regulation as well. I think that when I worked at Ormond Abbey, which I didn't show you photos of in 1990, and I was a real novice, I came close, I think, to some real moments where it was a little bit too wild, where, for example, the candles began to set fire to the ancient, I can now tell this, ancient chapter house roof. And I could hear over my walkie-talkie, and of course I didn't know it, Dr. Sands, Dr. Sands. And I had no idea Dr. Sands meant fire. So I was going, who's Dr. Sands? Is someone ill? But those sort of handmadeness, the handmadeness of Barsham Fair, and the possibility to do it and not be constrained somehow, the possibility to take your space and do it willy-nilly, that we have lost that. We can't do that in this country. I'm sure we can in others, but we can't do that anymore. And that, I have seen that considerable change over 30 years of practice. And yes, I do yearn to do something a bit wilder. And I would argue that Calling Tree, made with Simon Whitehead, that you had a part in, thank you, Christina, in commissioning it. The man in the blue boiler suit with the megaphone, Ben Stammers, who's actually calling birdsong through the megaphone because he can mimic birds. He would set them off on record with crows squawking and run through the city and run through the park with these crows squawking off his back. And I have a feeling that was Simon and I going, yes, let's shake everything up and let's do something that perhaps if we'd said we'd do it, we wouldn't have been allowed to, just for a second. So I hope those are examples of spontaneity.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to the questions from the chat. There's one from Rachel Clare. Can you talk about how your work in Derry worked across the different communities and brought them together?
Thank you, Rachel. I personally didn't put pictures of that because it ended up, you saw the very first picture of the woman being thrown in the air of Derry. It ended up as a film piece, so I didn't put it in the slideshow. Very briefly, Derry, Londonderry, as you're supposed to call it, is a northern, a city in Northern Ireland that has a divide across religious, Catholic and Protestant boundaries, that has a history of trouble and violence that is worryingly close to the surface because of what's happened with the new Brexit, etc. I was asked to work there, and it took me a long time to research whether, as an English woman who had grown up seeing those troubles with the British Army occupying the city, should be there and should be making work. And that's one example where I felt that even though I knew I would be walking on eggshells and that some would not welcome me, that I had the most welcome from the local artists. So that's what I did first, met all the local artists, asked them point blank, should I, as an English woman, be coming here to make work? And so I used, so when I was welcome and they said yes, I felt my job and my responsibility was to look at that city from the outside, from an outsider's point of view, but find out as much as I could about it. So Rachel's right, there are invisible divides that you cannot see. There is a wall, but there are other, and there are fences, but there are other invisible divides across open spaces down the middle of straight streets, etc. And I felt that what I could do in this panoramic film projection piece that was all shot outdoors over 10 days was have floods of children and people crossing those boundaries, dancing across those boundaries, to make it seem like there were none, to in a way destroy the boundaries that are in people's memories and thought for a second through the dance. And just one example of that, the team of dancers I worked with, who were mainly Catholics, the Echo Echo Dance Theatre team, told me after I'd made the work and it was finished that they had danced down a street that they had never ever set foot on before, and they were all in their 30s growing up in that city. They could dance down it, but they couldn't walk down it. So dancing can actually break through historic conflicts, but one has to do it super sensitively.
Thank you. We have a great question here from Alice. I really enjoyed how you talked about the importance of being sensitive to the scope and role that the site holds in the community when making work outdoors. I was wondering, as you said that your creative process can be up to 2 years long, have you ever found that this role has changed over time? And if so, how did that affect the work you were making? So the sort of, I guess, the resonance of the site evolves as you're making the work.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Alice. That must have happened. I think that what happens is, and by the way, I'm not there every day for 2 years. It's sort of sporadic, but I think what happens is that you start to understand a site more and more as you're there regularly, because you see the patterns of the site. So you think you know a site from a particular community's perspective. And then, for example, in the Bloomsbury Square that Christina knows, I sort of knew it from the Friends of the Park's perspective, from the gardeners' perspective, from the local dog walkers, I would say from the middle class users. Then I got to know it from the sleeper who slept there, and I realized that people got in there before the gates closed and hid and then slept there. Then I saw, though didn't get to know it, from the young people who I suspect there was some criminal activity, and at one point there was a police raid for knives and drugs, and there were a lot of mopeds being used for getting, phones. And unfortunately, the young people thought we'd grassed on them, which we hadn't. So that was very difficult. So that was a whole nother community there. So I guess you start to see the layers of whose home this is. The woodpeckers nesting in the Tottenham tree that we got to know, the starlings that took over the nesting hole. And then you also have massive surprises that happen in an instant. So in Tottenham, we were all rehearsing, ready, getting to know everybody, working with the local schools. And we arrived one day and affairs arrived. And it's taken over the entire site. And there's fencing all around the tree with a one of these roller coaster things right beside the tree. So even with the best intentions, you think you know everything that's going on, something as massive as that can still happen. So I don't know if I've quite answered that, but it's something about the multi-layeredness of a site that you get to know.
Yeah, and how you discover it over time.
Yeah.
There are a couple of questions about the current COVID climate,
Yes.
and a question about how outdoor dance, what role it might play in a sort of post-COVID recovery. But then another sort of related question, which is, reflecting on the fact that our, there's been an outburst of movement in public spaces recently, and we're also in a situation where our movements have been policed in ways they haven't been before. And I wonder if you can comment on those aspects.
Yeah, I know. I purposefully didn't put it in the keynote speech because I thought I'd just get tied in knots if I did. So thank you. Of course, we have to come back to the present. I haven't. Oh, no, I have. I did do an outdoor film just between 2 lockdowns. What can I say? Yes, it plays a massive role in our recovery and in our future. There's no question. But I can hear a little voice that I must make clear in my brain. I can hear a little voice that is also saying that we have to look after the art as well. So I guess I'm trying to say that if we're going to move outdoors, be aware that the context of moving your work outdoors will affect your work. Your work may have to change, or you have to find the site that will house your work in the best way so it doesn't get destroyed. Because I really do believe that context just changes work completely. So if there are young artists listening to me who feel they've got to move outdoors, just take your time, find out how to form that partnership. But absolutely, it is the way forward, and that's what's so exciting about it. And maybe it's a way of deepening our bodily relationship with site and with community. So I see it as really, really positive, but I'm also thinking just take one's time as artists to find out how best to navigate this time. And I'm really sympathetic because I'm finding it really hard too. So of how and what my next step will be, and etc. I hope that answers it slightly.
So we are coming to the end, but I want to just finish with one more question. Amy has put a question in the chat about what advice you would give to young makers starting out, wanting to work outdoors, and particularly wanting to make their work free when given the financial constraints. And I wonder if I might add to that question, you know, what advice would you have to the sector to better support outdoor arts and outdoor makers?
So advice to the sector, and I know this is really counterpoint to what's probably going to happen in terms of cuts in funding, is advice to the sector would be to really understand the diversity of practice. I couldn't get that really fully enough in my keynote speech. If you think of someone like Simon Whitehead, who walks down rivers in Wales, and Charlotte, that you're going to hear, Charlotte Spencer, who works in a very different way with sight, and then the wonderful things that the organizations that have set this up put on with the fantastic dancing in festivals and things that arrive and disappear. So there is this massive range. And I would argue that as a sector, we need to understand how all of those practices are really vital to our kind of, our cultural well-being, as well as every other form of well-being for sight and people. So I guess I'm saying there that don't be afraid of the time it might take to do a work like in the way I would work. It's hard and it's expensive sometimes, but it's worth it, I feel. The other thing, advice for young people about being free to view, that's a tricky one. I mean, maybe we do just have to get out there and do it. I mean, I often have wondered about this one I shared, the Queen Square one, which is only a 15-minute dance, but I wanted to pick it apart because of its richness. After I did that for years, and maybe I still will, I kept thinking, well, maybe I should just wander around the city and do this. Just find someone on a bench and say, would you like a 3-minute dance? And would you like to dedicate it to someone? I never got up the nerve to do it. But that would have been, you know, spontaneous, and you wouldn't need to ask anyone's permission for it. So short, small scale, just do it. That's what I'd say. Am I allowed to say that, Christina?
Yeah, well, I think that's a brilliant way to finish. Thank you. Thank you so much, Rosemary, for all your insights.
It's a pleasure.
Next up, we have the session on politics and poetics of outdoor dance, which is at 11:10. So you've got time to make yourself a cuppa and come back and watch the next session. While we've been talking, Temujin has been busy scribing the event. And so we're going to finish with an animation of that process. Thanks very much.